Hello, welcome to the Omnivorous Bookworm. My name is Lauren, and in today's video, I wanted to do 6 books that have really opened my mind or changed me in some way. I love to see these from other people, so I thought I would do my own. It's harder than I thought to think about it because obviously, if you love books, you've read so many in your life, but these were just the ones that stood out to me when I think back on things. Obviously it's going to be more skewed to things that I've read recently because like that's fresh in my mind. Um, but these are books, I didn't necessarily change my mind because it's not like I thought like, anything, but it made me look at things in a different way, or it made me open my mind in a way that was unique because of this book. And they're all fictional because obviously nonfiction is its whole other thing. So the first one I have is Mornings in Jenin by Susan Abulhawa. So this book is about a family in Palestine. It's a historical, and it takes place, it takes place over a long period, but it takes place when so after the British, so they've already been conquered by the British when the book takes place, and now the British are giving Palestine over to become Israel, and people are taking their homes and they're being subjugated as second-class citizens and or not even citizens, and all the violence. And it's a hard book to read. Like, it's not easy or fun or anything like that. And I actually want to reread it because it's been several years since I have read it. But I just remember after I read it, it was just one of those books that you just get so sucked into. And then after I read it, it's like you just want to hug everybody in your family because you're just like, oh, I'm so thankful that everybody's alive and healthy. Um, and it makes you very, aware of how, if you haven't gone through something like that, obviously you can never completely empathize or completely understand, but it gives you like the tiniest bit of understanding, and even that tiny bit is so just illuminating. And I think when I read it, I had never really thought about, like, Palestine or Israel. It was just sort of like, oh, that's like a political thing that's over somewhere, and it was something you heard about on the news. Um, it felt like too complicated to understand. And obviously, if you get into the details of it, it's very complicated. And I'm not, saying anything about any particular person or politically or anything, but how things were done is just horrifying. It's really, really horrifying. And that those things continue to happen and nobody's internationally is really doing anything about it is really sad. And just, I don't know. That book was just, ugh. So the second book, I have 6 of them, I think I said that, is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. So this is a classic. And the reason I picked this was, like, growing up in the US, we didn't really learn, at least in my school, about other countries. We just learned about the US. and what they wanted us to know about the US. But I didn't really understand the difference between, like, the north of England and the south of England, especially historically. And so that was really interesting. And it's also interesting because even though it applies to the UK, this was happening in a lot of countries at this time, was like labor laws, labor restrictions, how workers are treated, the Industrial Revolution, you know, all of that stuff, and the laws that became in place. Like, I remember there's like one scene where they talk about, because they're like have these looms and they're making clothes, and so there's all this like cotton floating in the air, um, and the workers are of course inhaling it, and over time they're getting sick and dying from these diseases because they're in these like closed and enclosed places. And one of the characters was talking about it and saying, well, they do have things that can, like a fan basically, that can suck all of this stuff out of the air. She said, but like that costs money and it doesn't make them any profit, so why would they use it? And it's just, you know, just as a reminder that, you know, if whatever you feel about any economic system, like there has to be rules, like we have to protect people. And then when you go even deeper, that at this time where they were getting the cotton from was being gotten by slave labor, and like how those workers, it's just it's one of those things where you just see this system and you see these people and you realize like the reason like most people work 8 hours a day or 5 days a week or whatever the rules are, that didn't come about like magically. Like people really had to suffer and go on strike and do a lot of things for us to benefit today. And it just makes you really grateful to be alive today and all of that. So that book definitely. The next two books I have are by the same person actually. It's She Breathed Two Worlds and When the Future Came Too Soon, and those are both by Selina, Siak, Yoke, and they're part of, they call it the Malayan saga, but they're independent. They have different characters and everything. She Breathed Two Worlds is about, it's in Malaysia when the British are starting to colonize it from the perspective of a local person who is she's of Malay and Chinese descent. And at first, a lot of the people think, because Malaysia has had a long history of immigration, there's a lot of people, you know, who are Malay or who are Chinese and who are from India. And when those groups would come, they would just sort of come and bring their customs and influence. And so they kind of were thinking that the British were going to do that too. And they were thinking like, oh, well, they're being a little bit harsh, you know, like they need to chill out kind of. But it starts to get to the point where like, oh no, like they're taking over, and how upsetting that is for them and how they have to deal with it. And then this woman and her life, and they're like getting rid of a lot of the customs and a lot of their culture is disappearing because of the British influence that they're forcing on them. So that book, and then When the Future Comes Too Soon, is the same family. Some years later, it's like the story from the daughter-in-law of the first woman. And in that book, it takes place during World War II, and it's still from the perspective of the Malaysian people, well, that same family. And so the Japanese are coming, and they think that the British are going to protect them because the British have like taken over everything by now. And obviously it's they can't. It's getting to the point where they're, you know, and they don't, and they even talk about it in the book, like they don't care about Malaysia. They'll protect Singapore, but they won't protect us. And so when the British come in, or not the British, the Japanese come in, the British are already gone. So they're leaving. They're taking anybody who has like family connections. So people are like trying to find somebody, or like trying to find a way to get out. And they can't, so they're just like sitting ducks. And since a lot of the people in Malaysia have Chinese descent and are of Chinese descent, and the Japanese are fighting the Chinese, and they think that they're spies, and there's all this horrible things that start to happen. And it's very interesting, that book, and I think it just opened my perspective, because usually when you hear about World War II, at least coming from the US, growing up there, it was either from the U.S. perspective, from you know, the British perspective, from, you know, different groups within the U.S., even like a Japanese perspective or the German perspective, but you never really heard, or was never really discussed, at least when I was in university or whatever, like how people, what other people had to go through who weren't even directly connected with the war, but they were just sort of the like casualties because they were in part of the colonies, or they were, you know, somehow connected without, like, they were already conquered and now they're connected to this war, and it's just like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. All right, and then the last two I read when I was a kid, so, but I feel like they really did impact me a lot. The first one or the, yeah, would be, I think a lot of people would relate to this, is Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl. You know, I just remember reading that in school and being so impacted by thinking that, like, oh, she was a kid just like me. I mean, I feel like everybody has that same experience where, but I feel like with that book, whenever I hear about a conflict or anything happening in another place, you know, it's always just to like think about, like, well, how many Anne Franks are there? Like, how many kids, how many innocent people are in the middle of this thing? Um, and we need to do our best, like, internationally, like, not us individuals, I mean, if we can, but to protect them and to help them and to, like, so that that doesn't keep happening. And then the last one is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I read that in school as well, and I feel like it's just very pertinent. And I always just remember stuff from that book, and brings it up, like when they have like the pills that they take to make themselves happy, and like the speech that they would say the opposite of what they really mean. All of that stuff is just like, it just really had an impact on me for some reason, reading it at that age. I didn't like a lot of books that I had to read in school, but that was one of the ones that really stuck with me, and I feel like has impacted me. So those are my 6 books that I feel like have opened my mind or changed me or have influenced me, hopefully for the good, in some way. So let me know, what are some of the books that you feel like, whether you were a kid or an adult, like, impacted you or changed you or made you think about things in a different way. And please let me know, because I would be interested to hear other people's experiences. So please like and subscribe, because I'm a new channel and every subscriber is very much appreciated. So I will see you next time. Bye bye.